Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald. Dr. McDonald, who goes by MC, is a research professor and life coach who has been researching, lecturing, and publishing on the neuroscience, psychology, and lived experience of trauma since beginning her PhD in 2009. Her new book, Unbroken, The Trauma Response is Never Wrong, is out now. It is an incredible read. This isn't sponsored. I picked this book up and I couldn't put it down. It taught me so much, and today we are sitting down to discuss everything from her book, everything from her life, and we are specifically talking about how us in our 20s can go about navigating and understanding trauma. The link to MC's book is down in the show notes, as well as the links to her Instagram and website. I highly encourage you to go support her. She's doing incredible work, and I can't thank her enough for joining me for today. If you enjoyed today's show, please follow along and leave a rating. It really is the best way to help grow the show, and I can't thank you enough for being a supporter. And thank you for tuning in to the R20s podcast. Without further ado, Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald. So I wanted to start the same way that you started your book, with 5 little words, and it's, hey, you're not alone. It's such a simple phrase and such simple words put together with a lot of meaning in them.
Yes.
Why did you choose to start that way? Because I think it's such an important message, and I thought that was a great way to set the tone.
It's so funny. No one's asked me that, and it's making me emotional in this moment. I don't know why. It's kind of surprising. Just making me cry right off the bat. I've been working with folks who have had trauma for about 11 years, one-on-one as, coaching clients. And I've also been working with folks dealing with trauma as research subjects. And I have been going through trauma. And I think that the common thread, no matter how different our experiences are, is that trauma tricks you into thinking you're alone. And I wanted to start the book with that exact message because you're not alone. It's a trick. Trauma is tricking you into thinking you're alone, and you're not. And I wanted to just start on that same footing so that anyone who picked the book up is going to say, oh, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe I have been tricked,
Absolutely. And just from my own experiences with interactions from friends, my own personal experiences when I've experienced times of, I don't want to call it depression because I've never been formally diagnosed, but definitely sadness and stress.
Mm-hmm.
Being alone in my own mind, I feel trapped. And that was one of my biggest, I don't want to call it mistakes, but biggest, what's the words I'm looking for? Just something that I misconstrued. Where
it's a trick. Like you're tricked into thinking you're alone.
There you go. You said it yourself. Yeah, trick.
Yeah.
I told myself all the time that no one else could possibly understand what I'm thinking right now. No one could possibly be in my mind, and it's a lie, and it's a key that we need to open ourselves up to. That we need to, and you talk about it all in the book, which is incredible. I think everybody needs to check it out. Where
thank you.
You're welcome. It's the narrative that we tell ourselves, and you talk a lot about narrative, and I think one of the key parts of this conversation is language and just the words that we use, their meaning behind them. And in this case, sometimes the lack of meaning behind them, where the definition of trauma that you give in the book, it has 2 parts. It's the emotions that it brings up are unbearable is the key word, and it lacks a relational home. So I want to start with the first part where it's unbearable.
Yeah.
Unbearable is one of those words like awesome, where I say everything is awesome. Like I found a sock when I was cleaning up the other day behind like my cabinet. I was like, awesome, I found my sock. And then I'll use it the same way to be like, oh, I just went to like this amazing show. It was awesome. It was so cool. One's actually awesome. And then like one's finding my sock. So
right.
It loses meaning when you have that wide net cast. And you mentioned the same thing in the book. When we talk about what's unbearable, you work with students and they'll tell you that the dining hall food is unbearable and insufferable. Is it though? I don't know. So when we're taking a look at the language of it, first of all, unbearable is something that we can't integrate into our memory. Can you talk about integration, and with trauma, why is it important to integrate the trauma back into our memory, and why is it currently out of place?
Yeah. Oh man, there's so much to talk about there. Can we start with the language? Can we circle back to the Okay. I think that, one of the reasons I reached for unbearable is because we were so overusing the word trauma and PTSD, and my students were traumatized by their dorm food, and they were traumatized by their roommates' sleeping habits, and they were traumatized by their chemistry exam, and they were traumatized by all of these things. And we have to be careful because words matter, and like we run the risk sometimes of stretching them to the point of absolute meaninglessness. And so I think unbearability does a lot of work, because if you sit down the definition of trauma is such a sliding scale. It's such a moving target in the field of psychology and in society that we have to kind of put that aside for a second.
Mhm.
And but if you sit down and you ask yourself, is this actually unbearable? You come up against a bar pretty quickly. That's pretty high, right? I can use the language in a colorful way to say, like, oh, this winter in California was unbearable because it was really bad.
Yeah.
But what I actually mean is not that it was unbearable. It might have been for some, but it was uncomfortable. It was unfortunate. It was depressing. It was all of these things. And I think, like, we need to expand our language rather than restrict it. And we live in a moment where we are all reaching for single words to explain really complex emotions and experiences.
Yeah.
And so that's that piece. And then the piece about integration is that I think one of the things that I see that's really corrosive when it comes to understanding trauma and healing is that we think that we've healed when we stop feeling. And so this is true of, like, breakups. This is true of difficult work stuff, big transitions. We think, like, okay, when I stop feeling this way, then I'll know that I'm healed. And we are not, what we're not understanding in that, the way that we contextualize that is that when we ask ourselves not to feel, we're asking our brain to do something that's impossible. Trauma is an experience that shatters memory. And so traumatic memories, and this is another place where language really falls apart, traumatic memories are not actually memories. They're instances of reliving because they're not integrated. And so the goal of trauma healing is to integrate a trauma. It's not to take the feeling out of it, because all of our memories are supposed to have emotional content. That's part of how we find them in the brain. And
Mhm.
so integration looks like getting the trauma memory to be recognizable by your brain as something that happened in the past rather than something that you're going through it in this moment. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And when I when I read that passage in the book, I'm a big movie nerd.
Yeah. Oh,
Have you
fun.
ever
Me
seen the
too.
Have you ever seen the movie Arrival?
No,
Oh, it's a great one. You have to check it out. I
I'm
watched it on
going to.
YouTube recently.
Okay.
It was like free on YouTube. It's Amy Adams, Jeremy Renner, and I'm not going to spoil it, but
You can
one
if
of
you need to for the point. I'll
oh
watch
no,
it anyway.
it's fine. I'll talk about like the main theme of it. I mean, it's alien sci-fi. There's like an alien invasion, and Amy Adams
Okay.
plays a linguist, and they call her in to
Oh,
basically
cool.
decipher the language of the alien. And there's one part of the movie where she's working on identifying certain words that they're using, and they don't speak from left to right like we do. Like if we were to write a sentence, we would write from left to right. Their speech is circular. It's
Mm.
time is a flat circle for them. That's like one of the main
Hmm.
points. And one of the words that they think that they know that the aliens use is weapon. Like the aliens are going to use a weapon, but they're really trying to say tool, as in language is a
Mm.
tool. Um, and when I read that part about memory, there's some other sci-fi stuff that comes in with the memory part, but memory being a flat circle, and you have these memories that are coming into the now, where
Mm.
we try to think of time very linearly. And when you don't understand what's going on with trauma, and you can't understand why something that happened in the past is now coming into the current moment as we perceive it, you can't understand that your brain's currently not operating on that linear path that we're so
Mm.
accustomed to. It's really fascinating. The body, as you discussed, is a really fascinating mechanism and a machine when it comes to processing trauma and the response that trauma induces in us. And I just want you to talk a little bit about the science behind it. Again, I'm a science nerd too. So you talk about five key players in the brain, and with the sympathetic nervous system being included in there too. Can you just take a high level overview of those five key players, and when that fight, flight, or freeze response is being initiated, what's happening in the body that someone who might be experiencing trauma can't make the connection between that response and what they're currently feeling at the time?
Yes, but I'm, like, totally stuck on time as a flat circle. So, like,
I've
I don't
seen
know if I can remember all the stuff about the brain.
I've seen it a couple. Every time I see time as a flat circle, I get caught up in it too. I've watched like Watchmen, like there's like
Mhm.
superhero comic stuff, and like Doctor
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Manhattan experiences time as a flat circle. And every time I see it, I'm like, oh, it's so fascinating that we perceive time linearly, but
And
other
well, and maybe the thing is we're rendering it linear, but it isn't actually
yeah
linear. So when we tell a story, you're rendering it linearly, but that doesn't mean that that's what it is in the world. Anyway,
Exactly. And if you watch
sorry.
Arrival, you'll see the payoff. I can't spoil the payoff because it's so cool, but the whole
I'm gonna
payoff
watch it
is,
today. Man,
yeah,
this is
it's
exciting.
not linear. Um, but yeah,
And that's because I think, and the way it's so cool to bring that up in terms of trauma, because one of the things that's going on, I mean, trauma is an injury of memory and it's an injury of time. It explodes the recording mechanism in your brain, which I'll talk about what that area is in a second.
yeah,
And that's the source of all the symptoms. And so when you're struggling with PTSD, you are having this really strange, upsetting experience of living in multiple time periods at once.
yeah,
Even though everyone around you is living in the present and they're expecting you to live in the present, you're in the past and the present and this other past. And that's really profoundly confusing because our brain can't really handle all of that at once.
yeah. And we just talked about we can't even reconcile our thoughts to begin with. Now try to bring that idea to someone and say, yeah, you're living in two current time periods
Yeah,
at once, and now you're try to explain that to someone else. How could they
right.
possibly understand? Yeah, and we just add a whole level of complexity to it, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's also, I
it just
think,
adds to that. Yeah,
totally. It's also why I think you're a lot of folks when they're dealing with the beginning symptoms of PTSD really think that they're losing their mind
yeah,
because your perception, these things you thought you could rely on, your perception being one of them,
hmm,
totally betrays you.
yeah,
And so you stop trusting the things that are very foundational and basic about being a human being in the world, that you're seeing what's in front of you being one, you know. Um,
absolutely.
okay, sorry. Tangent. Let's go back to the brain thing.
Tangents are good. Tangents are
Tangents are
great.
good.
Yeah.
So basically, we can make this really simple and kind of high level, and by looking at what happens in your brain when you have a normal event, and then what happens in your brain when you have an event that's really significantly overwhelming and is potentially going to be long-term trauma. So when you have a normal event, like let's say you go to work, something like mildly funny happens, your brain is basically probably like close to homeostasis. If your brain was a video game, the goal would be homeostasis, which just
Hmm.
means equal blood flow and electrical activity across the cortex. That's what your brain and body and all of your systems are trying to get to. And it's kind of a battle all the time because your brain and system are they're taking in information and data from outside of in the world and also from inside your system. And so you're at work, something funny happens, most of your brain areas are online and working. And so within 4 to 24 hours after that funny thing happens at work, you get a consolidated memory file. And the memory file has three things: it has a narrative, beginning, middle, and end. So you can tell that story. It has emotional content. In that case, it's humor. And then it has a set of meaning tags, which might be like chronology, significance, anything like that, so that your brain is capable of finding that story later, taking it out, feeling some of the emotional content, telling the story, and then putting it away with relative ease.
Hmm.
So I always tell this funny story about my coworker. Um, a long time ago, when I worked in an office in New York, was on a Weight Watchers plan, and he had lost like a really incredible amount of weight, and he was super pumped about it, and he was fitting into all these old new, these clothes that he hadn't been able to wear for a long time. And he came into the office one morning, and he was prancing around and being like, "Look at these pants! I haven't fit into them since like whatever 10 years ago."
Yeah.
And then he bent down to grab a file out of a file cabinet, and his pants split. And he had to, luckily our office was right above like Banana Republic, so he ran downstairs and got pants. And he it was not embarrassing for, I mean, I'm sure it was embarrassing, but we all
Yeah.
laughed about it together. It was a funny thing. And so when someone asks me to tell a funny office story, I can pull that memory file out, I can tell you about it, we can laugh about it, and then I can put it away and keep talking about the other parts of the brain that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And so that memory consolidation means that all of my brain systems were online, and I was able to get an organized, retrievable memory file that gets stored in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. When something overwhelming happens, um, your brain adapts because it understands that you are potentially in mortal danger. And so it pushes blood flow and electrical activity away from homeostasis and more towards an adaptive space where you're going to be able to respond to that threat in a way that's more likely to keep you alive. One of the systems that goes offline when that happens is this recording mechanism, this hippocampus, the memory file creation. And so what ends up happening is that you still get a memory file, but the memory file isn't organized. So when I go to pull it out, instead of being able to tell you a coherent story, beginning, middle, and end, feel some of the emotional content and put it away, something else happens. The brain doesn't like disorganized memory files.
Mm.
Because what the brain is trying to do is figure out which things are dangerous and which things are safe. And when you have a disorganized memory file, your brain can't tell, is this dangerous? Is this safe? So it tries to sort of help you by pushing the memory to the front of your mind anytime something enters into your perception that looks like something from that file. So your brain's like, oh, that color red is the same color red as was in this file. Let me push this to the front of your mind. The problem is that the fear center in your brain also recognizes the color red. So when that memory gets pushed to the front of your mind, your brain and body then respond as if the initial traumatic event were happening again. So to use a really simple example, let's say you were mugged and the person that mugged you was wearing a red shirt, and you go through this process, you survive the situation, you get out of the situation, it's over. But then like 6 months later, your coworker comes into work wearing the same red that that mugger wore, and they walk by your cubicle, and all of a sudden you're feeling panic and you don't know why. That's because you've got a disorganized memory file that the brain doesn't yet recognize as a past memory. So you
Yeah.
can't cognitively go, oh, Joe's wearing that same color red as the guy who mugged me. This is why I'm feeling panic. I'm going to go take a walk. Does that make sense? It's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot for someone who might be unfamiliar with the topic to take in. I,
Hmm.
I think I had to read it a couple times to truly understand it, where
Hmm.
there's a lot to this that has to deal with our lack of knowledge of ourself.
Yeah.
And we're not no fault because our brain again will do what it needs to do to survive, and it will suppress some of those memories so we don't have to think about them. But when they reoccur, it's very difficult for us to pinpoint what the source might be,
Hmm.
and why, especially why our response might be the way that it is.
Hmm.
And it kind of leans into the next point that you talk about a lot is when those feelings come up and we feel that isolation. If we wanted to talk about it, we feel this immense sense of shame
Hmm.
where it's something that we feel like maybe we shouldn't be feeling, especially if we're looking at trauma. It's something that has been referred to as big T and small T trauma, where
Hmm.
if there's small T trauma, which is something that is traumatic, and it was it was meant to kind of widen the net on trauma. But if it's something
Hmm.
like a breakup or something like you missed out on a really good opportunity that you had worked really hard for, something that caused trauma, but
Hmm.
in societal standards, especially amongst young people who love to
Yeah.
be really mean and tear other people down,
Hmm.
um, it can come off as shameful when we
Hmm.
try to express what we're feeling. You talk about in your book that your 20s was not an easy time, and
No.
you had yeah, you had that same sense of shame, and it was really difficult to navigate.
Hmm.
Were you going through that period alone? I know in the book you talk about, and on your podcast, that after the death of your mother, it kind of splintered your family in a way that you hadn't anticipated, where
Hmm.
you always think that you're going to stick through it together. There's a lot of things that we think, but until you're actually in the moment, you can never truly know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And going through that moment, were you alone in your own head? And did you feel that you had anyone or any resource that you could look towards to work your way and discuss what you were feeling? Or was it really a self journey? I don't know if that's the right term, but just a journey that you had to go on by yourself.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I certainly thought I was alone, and I think in a lot of ways I was partially alone, because I
Mhm.
think, I work with college students and graduate students. I think that the 20 are the decade that is the 20s, I think is rife for trauma, because there's so much. And that doesn't mean that like your 20s are traumatic, period, end of story. It's just
Yeah.
that there's so much that's in flux. You're trying to figure out who you are. Everyone is telling you it's this exciting time and the world is your oyster, but you have no idea what you're doing or where you're going.
Yeah.
Everything feels like it's the first time. Graduating college can feel like being thrown off a cliff. Like there are all these expectations, and you're exiting the school system that you've been in your whole life, and so there's this structural change. There's often breakups and friend shifting things that happen naturally but are really painful. And so I was going through that. The first job that I had out of college was on Wall Street, which was not a good fit for me at all. And so then I went back to grad school and was living in New York and trying to figure out how to pay rent and go to school full time and work full time at this other job. And it was a lot. And then my parents both died. And and no one in my field of vision, even my coworkers who were in their 50s, had lost both of their parents. And so I think I was going through like a very unique situation and also a very common situation just at the wrong time. Talk about like exploding time. These are things that are not supposed to happen when you're 24.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have a lot of friends who could understand what I was going through at all. And at the same time, I had a lot of friends who could understand at least part of what I was going through, because we were all in that boat of like, we are in our 20s and we don't know what's going on or where we're going. Um, and so I thankfully went into therapy. I really started struggling with panic attacks that were getting in the way of everything. And so I went to therapy in earnest for the first time. And I'm so grateful for that, because that was an absolute, I had a great therapist. She was an absolute lifeline. So I wasn't alone in that sense, but at the same time, I felt really at sea and alone. And then my family, when your parents die, regardless of what your family system looks like, you lose your anchors.
Yeah.
And so there's this sense of unity that just explodes, that we're no longer this like family system. And then with 6 kids who are grieving differently, it just got really complicated. None of us knew how to talk about it. Everyone was at a different age and a different kind of point in their life. And so yeah, I guess that's a very long way of saying, yeah, I felt really, really alone.
It's not long. It's more appreciated than I think I can express, that
Oh,
you're
good.
open and honest about how you felt during that time.
Hmm.
Because I know there's plenty of people who may be listening that are undergoing something very similar,
Hmm.
and they haven't found that resource for them yet. Maybe it's in a therapist, maybe it's in a friend, maybe it's
Hmm.
someone they come across just on the street who's willing to talk to them.
Yeah.
And hearing stories and hearing that it wasn't something that you overcame easily. It was a long
Hmm.
journey, and it's still a journey that we're all on. There's no
Hmm.
real destination with healing. It's not something that you find the light at the end of the tunnel and there's just a building waiting for you to walk in, and
You're
now you're
right.
home.
Right.
It's something that it's going to be with you for
Mhm.
forever and ever. Um,
Mhm.
and it's not the easiest thing for someone to hear, especially someone in their 20s. They don't even have a fully developed sense of who they are yet, and they might be
Mhm.
struggling with something that is kind of crippling that sense of self.
Yeah.
And
And
so
I think like,
yeah,
yeah, if I could like tell people in their 20s one thing, if I could go back and tell myself one thing, it would be like, okay, your job right now is not to figure everything out.
hmm
Your job is to figure out how to walk the path. That's it.
yeah,
And that becomes a lot more manageable. How are you going to take care of yourself? How are you going to walk this path? How are you going to be open to the good and neutral and bad experiences that happen to you? And how are you going to support yourself in those moments? How are you going to resource yourself? I think we get into this isolated phase of like, especially in the age of social media, all my friends have it figured out and I don't, so I have to like sit alone in my house and figure it out.
yeah,
And I think it's about getting resourced, getting a therapist, figuring out who is in your corner, who can be on your advisory board,
yeah.
like, and help
Oh
you
yeah.
through that.
I've talked about it a couple of times on this show, just how social media is a great thing. I mean, it's how I met you.
Totally. Yeah.
But it's also a huge curse if you utilize it incorrectly. And if you're
Hmm.
one of the people who I used to be, absolutely just scrolling, watching people posting the highlights of their life, and I'm thinking to
Hmm.
myself, what am I doing wrong? And it just makes me feel worse about myself.
Hmm.
Um, but to open up to somebody is never easy, whether it's a therapist who
Yeah.
is always going to be there for you, and they're legally obligated not to tell anybody
Right.
the conversations that you have, or just a friend, a family member. It's trust that needs to be built because we're sharing some of the deepest parts of ourselves, the
Hmm.
parts that we don't even understand, and we're hoping that someone else can help us understand them.
Hmm.
How do you go about building trust with someone, especially in that type of scenario where you're meeting a therapist for the first time, you're opening up to a friend for the first time, and you don't know what the reaction is going to be? Is it
Hmm.
something, again, that you have to maybe reveal yourself in parts, or do you think that if you're ready, you can share anything that you need to at whatever time interval that you need to?
That's a good question. I think the answer is kind of different when you're talking, if you're talking about a coach or a therapist or a
Hmm.
friend. So we talk about coach slash therapist first. The first thing is that all of the research in psychology that looks at the efficacy of any psychological instrument or tool almost always shows that it is the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client that determines the success of the therapy, not the instrument itself. And I think
Yeah.
that's really important right now because people are reaching for particular modalities because they think like, oh, if I do this one thing, then this is going to cure me. But what's much more valuable is if you can focus on the quality of the relationship you have with your therapist. And so, what does that mean? You want a therapist who is attuned to you. You want a therapist who you feel like you can tell anything to. That's so critical. If you're
Mhm.
not telling your therapist everything, they don't have all the pieces. And if you feel like your therapist is going to judge you, that's very real in some circumstances. It's time to find a therapist who's not going to, because you need to have a sounding board. And that sounding board is going to be a lot more effective if you can give it all of the information.
Yeah.
So you're looking for attunement, non-judgment, and support. Basically, those are, I think, are the three things that are really important. And when it comes to a friend, I mean, I think you're kind of looking for the same thing, but I think we need to focus a lot more on like I call this like the concentric circles of friendship. I completely made this up. I'm sure someone else has also talked about this.
Yeah.
But I think we think so much about like, especially coming out of college, you think of like who are your closest friends, who are your like ride or die, you can tell absolutely anything to no matter what. And that's it is really important to have a couple of those friends who are really good and you can tell anything to. But I think it's
Yeah.
also important to have friends if you imagine like concentric circles kind of going out, that you'd have, you know, your inner circle is going to be your closest friends. Then you have maybe people that you went to school with and you're still friends with, but you're not super, super close, but you know, you always have a good time with. Those are in the next one. Maybe your coworkers who you get along with, maybe you hang out a couple nights a week, but you're not like, you know, super into each other's like trauma histories or anything like that. And then
Yeah.
people that you spend kind of like casual time with, like people in a yoga class or people at the gym or people who, you know, engage in some hobby with you but you don't really like know. I think we need to have people in all of those circles. And I think sometimes, especially in our 20s, we test friendships and relationships by trying to make them all fit into that inner circle, that tighter little thing where like if I can't tell this person absolutely everything, then they shouldn't be in my life. And
Yeah.
that's just too rigid a way to think about it. We actually need people in our lives at lots of different levels in order to feel socially scaffolded. And so I think that that it's important to have maybe 3 to 5 people that you feel like you're really close with, and then other kinds of people. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
I couldn't agree more, actually.
Oh,
Where
good.
I did a whole episode with two of my closest friends. We've been friends since we were like 5,
Yeah.
and we had this exact topic about, we're really close friends, and we feel comfortable sharing a lot about ourselves with each other. But even us, we're not completely open and honest with each other. And we're working
Hmm.
on that because it's also more of like just a male thing where we've been
Yeah.
ingrained in us that we should be reserved. But
Yep.
we talked about the importance of having, we called it like friends versus buddies. We have buddies
Oh, I love
who are,
that.
who are in our lives. Yeah. We have buddies who do like one thing with us. Like maybe we played baseball growing up. So maybe they're our baseball buddy. Maybe they're
Hmm.
our buddy who we know from school. They're in our class
Hmm.
together and they're really cool. We love having them around. But they might not be that person that we would go to
Yep.
with more of a deep problem, but they serve an amazing purpose in our life. It's not like
Hmm.
we're going to cut them out. Um,
Yeah.
I think something it's I don't want to call it a phenomenon, but I saw this multiple times, especially in college, where there will be a scenario where maybe two people will be together, and I've even been in this scenario before, Um, and it's around the concept of trauma dumping. Have any of your students told you this term
Hmm.
before? Have you heard
Oh
this one?
yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah, trauma dumping was prevalent, and I think it might have been misclassified a lot of the time. Where
Hmm.
I've been in this scenario, if no one else has been in this scenario, it might sound ridiculous, but this is how it happens sometimes. Where you'll be with a friend, it'll be like a weekend, it will be like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. Maybe you were just out having some drinks, and you're coming
Hmm.
back, and now it's just the two of you hanging out, and then your friend will just say something, and it sounds like it's coming out of left field, and maybe it's along the lines of like, man, I'm just really struggling with my breakup, or it gets a
Hmm.
little more intense where man, I'm really struggling just with mental health, and I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z stuff that you're not prepared for in that moment to hear.
Hmm.
And I think it comes back to the sense of language, where somebody's opening themselves up to you and they're doing their best to articulate what's going on, and you might not be ready as
Hmm.
someone who's on the receiving end.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion around trauma dumping about how it can harm relationships more than it does good.
Hmm.
And I think that might be being looked at from the wrong perspective, as if the person who is quote unquote dumping the trauma is the one who's harming the relationship. I think you can cause just as much harm as a friend if
Hmm.
you aren't able to articulate correctly as to what you're being told. I don't even think there needs to be a proper response, but maybe it's just your body language in the moment.
Hmm.
Maybe it's not what you say, but what you don't say. Maybe it's saying too
Hmm.
much as opposed to saying too little. But there's a lot of factors that I think prohibit friends from feeling comfortable sharing that side of them with people who they might think are the closest to them, because
Hmm.
we're young, we're really stupid sometimes. We don't know exactly what the right words are to say, especially if you're being
Hmm.
presented something for the first time and you have no concrete relation to it. If you haven't practiced your emotional intelligence, if you haven't made an effort to work on it, and
Hmm.
now you're in that position where someone's telling you, I need help, I want you to help
Hmm.
me. um, I think that's really difficult for both parties in that scenario.
Yeah.
And it's not really a question, just more of an anecdote
I
around what I
Can I
see.
weigh in on this though? Because I
Yeah,
think
of
this
course.
is
I
so
would love to get your
important.
opinion. Yeah.
I think there's three like layers at work here. And that makes things really complicated because you have to look at the three layers and understand them conceptually before you can figure out like what's going on in any given context or situation.
Hmm.
And so, one thing that I talk about in the book, the second part of the definition of trauma is, so you have unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home. And I think we can heal each other by being better at providing one another with a relational home.
Hmm.
Um, and what is a relational home? And my students get particularly upset about this term because they're like, what does that mean, and like
Yeah.
why isn't it more specific? We want definitions to give us a really like satisfying amount of specificity, but I think this one is a little bit vague on purpose because a relational home is going to change based on what the context and the situation is. And so when my students get upset about that, I say, okay, pause for a second and tell me what you did the last time one of your friends had a breakup. And they're like, "Oh, no problem." So I went over to their room and we deleted the guy from the phone, and then we got some ice cream and we watched these three movies. And the next weekend we went out and got new clothes and we went out and blah blah blah, like all this stuff. They
Yeah.
have a protocol for what to do when a friend has a breakup, and they're very
Yeah.
proud of that, and it's really effective. And so I think we're better at providing a relational home than we realize. I think one of the things that's corrosive about the way that we look at trauma is that the only space we can talk about it is in a therapist's office. And that's number one, not true. And number two, it is not sustainable, especially in 2023. We have all just been through a global traumatic event that is still
Yep.
going on that we have not begun to process. So we have to like level up and get better at providing each other a relational home. All of that being said, it's going to sound like I'm immediately contradicting myself. We also have to be mindful of other people's bandwidth
Hmm.
because I've had this with friends who will text you in the middle of the day. It's the middle of the workday, and there's paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of emergency emotional stuff going on that you don't have the time or the like wherewithal to answer in that moment, and it's hard to assess at what level of emergency this person is at. And there are some friendships I think that can get very one-sided that way, because if you provide a relational home and the other person kind of takes advantage of that, they continue to do this sort of like trauma dumping stuff without any kind of awareness of like where you might be in your own journey. Maybe you're struggling with a little bit of darkness or depression in the moment, and you don't really have a lot of extra energy to put out to provide somebody with a relational home. So I think we need to get better at, number one, checking in with each other about where we are at before we engage in that process, like before we ask for a relational home. And two, we need to get better at communicating when we are not there, because it's hard to say to your friend, like, I know you just went through a breakup. I think I might lose my job this week because of this mistake that I made. And I can't be there for you. I can't be as present for you as I want to be. Can we check in on Friday?
Yeah.
Like that feels like a risky thing to say, especially when you feel like your friendships may be in flux because of your age or, whatever. And I think the other thing that's this third layer here is that we live in a time of cancel culture.
Yeah.
And so if you say the wrong thing one time with your friend, since we are all so attuned to these little missteps, you have the potential of losing your relationship permanently. And I think that's really, really corrosive, because we need to give each other the grace to say the wrong thing sometimes. So if a friend texts me in the middle of the day, they've just gone through a breakup, I have sessions and work and all this stuff going on, and I'm like, oh man, I'm so sorry. That guy was kind of an ass. I can't wait for you to find the next guy.
Hmm.
You know, that might seem that might be the best I could do at that moment. And I might think like, oh, I'm being really supportive, I'm being encouraging. And that friend might feel like, wow, that was not attunement at all. I feel completely dismissed.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to provide each other with the grace to make those kinds of mistakes. Because I think sometimes what I see this in my clients all the time, is this immediate jump to burn the relationship down because of that one misstep. And we have to stop doing that. So that's three lots of, I mean, that's a lot. It's complicated.
Oh, that was so good though. It was that that point right there at the end. People don't focus on like small scale cancel culture like that.
No, they don't, and it's so important.
I guess we don't even refer to it as like cancel culture, but it's something that I see
Mhm,
all the time where one little thing happens
mhm,
and the friend is just done. I'm cutting you off.
mhm.
I'm not including you
Yep,
anymore.
yep.
We're so quick. I don't know if it's judgment or we're just on edge all the time, where if we see a potential
Mhm,
red flag, we're like, nope, done. I'm not going anywhere near that. I'm just gonna stick to my own self. I'm gonna focus on myself now.
mhm,
And maybe when I'm ready, I'll open myself up again. And that
mhm,
second portion that you talked about, just with understanding who you're dealing with and their emotions as well. We get so wrapped up in ourselves. I'm guilty of it all the time, where
mhm,
I'll be going through something, I'll be upset, and even not friends, just like my family, I'll be like, oh my gosh, I had a terrible day at work. This was awful, just the
mhm.
worst. I'll be on the phone with my mom, and she'll be like, okay, like you haven't asked me once like how my day was too.
Yeah.
Like you just been going on for like 15 minutes now.
Mhm,
And like maybe there's some stuff going on at home that I need to be
mhm.
privy to, and I need to be able to provide support to them, but I'm too busy being focused on something that, in this case, like if I'm angry at work, maybe it's like so insignificant and I'm just getting stuck on it, and
Mhm,
I'm letting it creep over into another aspect of my life that I shouldn't. I'm not taking the time to be emotionally intelligent and understand what's going on with someone else. And
mhm,
I think it's a fine line that we have to walk between taking care of
mhm.
ourselves and taking care of the ones that we love, especially. Um,
Absolutely.
but I don't know if anybody has a book on that balance. I don't know if anyone can write that book because it's
No, yeah.
individualized, and
It is, yeah.
it's something that we all need, just like healing. I don't think there's any end destination with that.
Mhm.
It's something that we need to work on over time.
One
And the
thing I
third,
think you
yeah,
can do, I start this with like with process groups that I run, is before you speak, ask for what you need,
that's a good one.
which is really hard to do, but it absolutely improves your life. Because the other thing that happens is that when we are doing this, like trauma dumping or even just venting, a lot of the time we are looking for a particular outcome that we have not communicated.
Yeah,
And so it could be the case, and I see this all the time in couples that come in, like one person just wants to be heard and the other person immediately goes into fix it mode. And
Yeah.
then the person who wants to be heard feels dismissed, and that ends up being corrosive to the relationship. And it's like, if you could sit down, and again, this is really hard, but it's, I think, a great practice, and say to your mom, I've had a really crappy day at work. Can I take 15 minutes to vent, and then we'll get to you? And what I'm looking for is just for you to listen. I don't need you to solve it.
I love
Or I'm looking for advice on these three things. I'm having this trouble at work. I know you've gone through this, something similar. Like, can we talk about that for a half an hour? You know what I mean? Like, just being a little bit more specific when we can about what we're looking for, I think, can help on both sides.
I think that's an amazing type of tool to use because so often we find ourselves in those situations where maybe it's
Mhm.
not a trauma dump. I hate that term. Sorry, I'm not going to use it anymore. But
No,
maybe
it's
we're
we
in
can
that
we can
conversation.
stop with it. Yeah.
But maybe we're just having a conversation with a friend, and
Mhm.
maybe they're trying to ask you about like, oh, I don't know what I should do. Should I do this on Saturday, or I have this other commitment that maybe I could go to? And
Mhm.
they're clearly looking for you to like pick for them.
Right.
They're not saying that they want you to pick for them. If
Right.
the conversation just started like, just pick one. I'm being really indecisive. What do you think sounds
Yeah.
cool? Doing this or doing this? That
Mhm.
makes everything a lot easier, and we're communicating with each other a lot better.
Completely.
That's a great
Yeah.
strategy. I'm gonna
Yeah. Yeah.
implement that tomorrow or today when I go talk to my parents on the phone or just talk to a friend.
Oh, perfect.
That's a really good one. Um, I want to circle back to that little old event that you talked about that happened 3 years ago.
Oh yeah.
That we're all still recovering from.
That tiny little thing. Yep.
Yeah, something happened. It was crazy. Um, with I graduated 2021.
Okay.
My graduating class, it hit mid second semester. So they sent us all home, just cold turkey. Nobody could come back.
Of your
It was
June, that's your junior
the junior
year, right?
year. Yeah,
Yeah.
it completely
Okay.
shut down. The following senior year, they had us do a hybrid style at first. So
Mhm.
like if we had a class on Monday and Thursday, we would go in on Monday and we would do all the social distancing. Nobody really
Mhm.
got to interact with anybody. And then on Thursday it would be fully remote, just like Zoom class.
Mhm.
Um, and that lasted right up until like the vaccines started to come out. So this was like April and like early April, I guess is the timeline. It gets a little
I
blurry now
know.
that it's 2 years ago. But it wasn't until then that things, if we want to call it normal, that's when it started to go back to somewhat normal. Like people were allowed to gather in larger groups. We didn't have like a full graduation. We did it by school. I went to a small liberal arts school called Fairfield in Connecticut.
Oh, I know Fairfield. My brother went there.
Oh, really? Awesome.
Yeah, I went to Holy Cross, which is like a kind of
Oh,
a sister
yeah.
school. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed it. But there was a lot of people who were upset at the time that they weren't going to have like a full graduation.
Yeah.
We did it by class. Like I was in the College of Arts and Sciences, so I did
Mhm.
mine, and then people who were in the business school did theirs, nursing. Um, so it just wasn't what people had anticipated. It,
Yeah.
and I think it ties really good into something you talked about in the book, which is moral injury,
Mhm.
where we have this perception about what we think life will be. We have to predict in order to survive because if we just look at it and say life is really scary, which it is,
Mhm.
we kind of shut down and then we don't want to do anything. So if we predict going into junior year, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much fun. We're going to be seniors next year. We're going to do all the senior stuff like partying and
Yeah.
absolutely not paying attention in class and doing what we're actually told to do. And then we're going
Yeah.
to go on, we're going to move to the city. We're going to have really fun jobs and everyone's going to
Mhm.
love everybody. And then none of that happens. And
Mhm.
it turns into you're sequestered with maybe two or three people. And you're not allowed to even go see the campus anymore. You can't even go to the dining hall without like signing up for a time. You can't do any of the activities that you thought you were going to do. And then you have to hold off on moving to the city for a little bit because people aren't even getting jobs out of school. And then once you go to the city,
Mhm.
it's nothing like you thought it would be. You're not having fun every single day of the week because there's this little thing called money that gets in the way. And everything that you had built up in your head, like it's going to be like Friends, the TV show, it's just none of it.
Mhm.
And you mentioned it too in the book that trauma and stress just tie really well with each other. They have a lot of
Yep.
overlap. And it might not be trauma that is a result of the pandemic, especially, but I think stress and a lack of understanding what we thought would be is it's been
Mhm.
really difficult for a lot of people that I've come across where they still haven't been able to do that integration that we talked about.
Mhm.
But it's almost for like a future memory, the memory that they thought they were going to have. They haven't been able to reconcile that the future is not what they thought it would look like.
Mhm.
And it's impacting them now. Again, times of flat circle, but it's impacting what they're currently going through. And
Mhm.
just as a friend to some people, I don't have the answer myself because we all went through it. And there are some aspects of my life too where I thought I would be with my friends, not with my friends all the time. I thought I would be doing a lot of different things than I currently am doing, and it's still difficult to try to think about
Mhm.
how things didn't work out as planned. But I think I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm just kind of talking now, but
No, but
I
it's
think
so yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah. Um, I guess I'm just looking for your response too on the. Again, there's not really a question. I'm just kind of looking for your opinion as someone who has an outside perspective and someone who works with students, especially students now today, right, where
Yeah.
it's a different world being a student today.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
they have 2 years of experience that I don't in that kind of environment that was a lot different than what I had when I first came into school.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested to hear your side of things too.
And I think so I've been teaching for God, I think like 15 years, which is like horrifying. Teaching college for 15 years. And so I have this interesting kind of viewpoint because I can see number one what it was like when I graduated college. Then I went back and taught at my college, which was wild. And then, going through these times, which it wasn't just the pandemic, like there's been upheaval for a long time in this country in a way that's pretty unprecedented.
Yeah.
And I want to say, like, this is a hard time in your life anyway. Going to college is hard. Even when it's great and wonderful, it's a huge change.
Hmm.
And change is experienced in the system, in your body as stress. Like there's
Yeah.
good stress and there's bad stress, but it is stress to go through that change. And it's then you get used to college and you get used to that whole thing and you start plotting out your life and then you graduate. And again, like I said before, sometimes I remember feeling like when I graduated, like that day, I remember really clearly because people were saying like, "Oh, this is the most exciting moment." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like I
Yeah.
feel like I'm getting shoved off a cliff. I have no idea what's
Yeah, I feel like
happening. Like
everything's
I'm
over.
supposed
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I've been in school my entire life. I don't know how to be not in school. Like where am I going? What am I doing? People are
Yeah.
treating me like an adult. I don't feel like an adult. So it's hard anyway. And then you have this overlay of the pandemic. And so to go back to the concept of moral injury, this is basically when the set of beliefs that were holding up the world crumble and you realize that they were made up. And you're left in this space of like this a complete existential crisis. Like what is anything? What is the purpose of anything? What is the meaning of anything? What kinds of beliefs do I want to reach back for? What kinds of new ones do I want to find? Like, and there's almost no societal awareness about that aspect of trauma. And so even if you are getting help, that part of your experience might not be addressed. And I think you said it so beautiful when it's when you said that it's like these future memories fade,
Hmm.
because that's such an eerie experience where you've imagined this future, and it's not just that you've imagined this in this delusional sense. You've had all of this societal imprinting that says this will be your future.
Yeah.
The graduating class before me had this future. I witnessed it. I was there, and
Yeah.
then it didn't happen. And it's like, how do you how do you meet an abyss? Like how do you address that? Because it's different. Like to meet a lack in the world is different than to meet an injury, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
A- And so I think when it comes to the integration process, you asked, like, how do you integrate that? I think the first thing is recognizing that it happened and it's real. One of my like purposes in life is to explode the hierarchy that we create around the definition of trauma, because there is no hierarchy. The body is experiencing trauma. Trauma is trauma is trauma. There is
Yeah.
no capital T trauma that's bigger and more real than some lowercase t trauma. If there's that kind of shattering and your nervous system is imprinting that, that's all you need to know. That part of the brain is not sophisticated enough to tell the difference between capital T and lowercase t trauma. So I think the first step is, and we have to come to this reckoning as a society, that these things were traumatic in different ways for different sets of people. I think that the trauma of the high school kids and of the college kids in particular gets dismissed because there's this assumption that a lot of those folks had homes to go to, they didn't have to work, right? Like the pandemic was quote unquote easier on them, and that's completely false.
Hmm.
And so I think there needs to be a societal reckoning that these things are, that they're real, and then the chance to process and talk about what that means for your whole generation's experience, and then what next, so
Yeah.
it's like this three phase thing. But it's a really awful thing to watch your future crumble like that.
It it's hard, especially I feel it more just for the people that I love, where
Hmm.
a lot of these future memories that we're referring to,
Hmm.
it would be one thing if they were just dreams, where maybe it's like,
Hmm.
oh my gosh,
Right.
I saw the prettiest girl in the park today. I just envisioned our whole future, and you're like, you don't even know anything about her. Like
Right.
you can't tell me a single thing. Like that's not real. But
That's kind of a delusion. Yeah.
a little bit. But if you can, like you said, you can watch your friends graduate and you can watch them do exactly what you thought they were going to do. If you can watch your family members achieve their goals that
Hmm.
you've grown up and your family has promoted them since you were a little kid and you're on the same path to doing it, and
Hmm.
then it all gets taken away,
Hmm.
seemingly just out of the blue, no reasoning behind it, and we can't reconcile why evil or just bad in general would be in the world. It's an
Hmm.
age old question
Yep.
that we struggle to answer ourselves. If you look towards religion, the answer is just to put your faith in a higher power, and
Hmm.
that answer is not good for some people. And some people will
Yep.
be like, that doesn't make any sense to me, and it turns them off
Hmm.
from religion. Some people find solace in it, some don't.
Hmm.
Um, but just the healing process as a whole and coming together after that, I was very fortunate that I have a really solid group of friends.
Hmm.
And how we got through it together is we realized that there are always the silver linings, and you refer to them as
Hmm.
the shards in your book. And
Yeah.
I think there are some cases, again, where there's extreme evil in the world and extreme bad, and even you refer to that there might be some controversy around this statement that there are shards that you can find
Hmm.
that will be a light to get you out of the tunnel.
Hmm.
And in the case of the pandemic, the shards that we found were, if none of this happened, we would have never have grown as close as we did. We would
Yeah.
not have shared all this time together, all these memories, just a core group of people who we truly care about. That would never have happened. We would have been doing the degenerate type of activities that college kids do, and none of us would see each other half the time. And
Hmm.
that was something that we looked towards. And going to a Jesuit school, they
Hmm.
always preached the idea of one of the core values is that they called it finding God in all things. If you're not
Yeah.
religious, you could just refer to it as finding good in all things.
Or meaning. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Exactly. And I challenged that idea. I've challenged it on the podcast before, where
Hmm.
I'm like, in the thing exactly, I don't know if there's good,
Yeah.
but
Right.
there are the shards that you can pick up. And I think part of that is paying it forward, where
Hmm.
someone or something happens and you are able to grow from it,
Hmm.
learn from it, and eventually get to a point where you can help ease someone else's pain and you
Hmm.
can help them get through that tough time so they will never have to experience that type of pain again. And,
Hmm.
if we're using like a silly example, like when your mom tells you to look both ways before you cross the street, I'm sure there was
Hmm.
someone someday, however many years ago, that didn't look both ways,
Yeah.
and
Right.
they paid the price a little bit. So
Hmm.
it's just simple things. It could be as that simple as that, or it can be on a whole deeper level. But you have to
Yeah.
have some certain level of strength to be able
Hmm.
to carry it forward. Um, and I think you've certainly done that. And the chapter in your book that hit me the hardest was your chapter about Lily. The reason the chapter hit me so hard is it was such a difficult experience. And
Hmm.
it's something that I know a lot of people are going to go through. And when it happens, they will never be ready.
Hmm.
But you have been able to pay it forward. You've been able to talk about your story, and you've been able to share that
Hmm.
there is a way to find light in the darkest of times, and you've been able to pay it forward. And
Yeah.
you talked about how you have a pitch for a new book about the last chapter of this current book, which is all around tiny little joys.
Hmm.
And I just want to ask you how you find joy in your day-to-day life. It's the theme of this whole show, is asking people how they find joy. So just
Hmm.
how do you uh, put yourself literally grounded. There's talk about tools of being grounded in the book, but how do you ground yourself and just embrace the moment, embrace everything around you, and think to yourself that one, I'm going to be okay, and two, I'm going to help other people be okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for mentioning the shards, and also for your kind words about that
Of
chapter
course.
and everything. I think the thing this was completely by I think most things that are beautiful get discovered completely by accident. If you
Hmm.
look into the history of scientific discovery and things like that, most things are just accidental. And when my father died, he died really suddenly, and the world expects you to just go back to normal. So I went back to New York, started working again, and was just absolutely crushed by grief, but going on anyway, which was really hard on my body and just in the grieving process in general. And I would kind of find myself in these moments just like literally lying on the floor, like wailing, just like I don't keening, like just grieving out loud. And you let that wave hit you. And then I just noticed that there was always a little thing that filtered into my perception at some point in those darkest moments. For some reason I feel like we're always on the floor. It's like the bathroom floor, the living room floor, like this
Yep.
we get down when we're like
we
in
want
those.
to be closer to the earth. It's weird.
It
There
is
might be
weird.
some
Yeah.
science behind it. I don't know.
I think it's that we're trying to you feel perceptually so unmoored that you're trying to like get, you know what I mean? Like that
Yeah.
stability of the ground.
Yeah.
And so I started noticing that there were these little things that would always filter into perception that were tiny little pieces of hope. And they were almost like relentless, like annoyingly so, where it was
Hmm.
just like, I really want to stay with this bad feeling and like kind of marinate in it, you know?
Yeah.
And then there would be like a kid laughing downstairs and it would filter through the window, or there would be like this little kind of, tiny little shard of light that made a rainbow across the floor. And, um, those became anchor points. And so I developed this practice that I call tiny little joys that I'm doing every day on TikTok, actually. And I think the way that you orient yourself towards joy is to realize that joy is not this superficial, silly thing. The book that I'm writing is going to be called Tiny Little, and then three adjectives, like, and I don't know what they are yet, so maybe you can help me. But it's
I
like
will. Yeah.
gritty, relentless, like something
Yeah.
joys, tiny little, like scrappy, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I know exactly. Yeah.
I think we think of joy as like this stupid thing. We do the same thing with hope. Like it's this like stupid, like airy thing that you can kind of like find sometimes. And it's not true. Joy is like audacious. It sits there right next to grief
Yeah.
and trauma and darkness. And it's so the practice that I developed called Tiny Little Joys is that you just try to find one thing every single day that contains within it a little bit of joy, even if you don't really feel it. And what that does is that it starts to rewire your brain, because our brains are hardwired to imprint negative because our brains are oriented towards survival. And so
Hmm.
it's in our benefit to imprint the negative things, the things we should be afraid of, all of that. But we have to manually imprint the positive. Otherwise, we start to lose our worldview and everything starts to look negative. We create this negativity bias, and all we see is the bad and the threatening. And that's, I think, particularly important right now because we're living in a really dangerous moment. And so, imprinting these tiny little things, and they can be tiny, like, I mean, tiny
Yeah.
little joys, like, you know, your cup of coffee, the fact that it's sunny today, a little flower you walked by, a kid's laugh, like anything that's tiny, and just imprint those things, meaning like sit in that and feel into the light a little bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the tiny little joy thing.
No, that's beautiful. That
Thank you.
it's something that I try to do more and more, is just appreciate the little things, like in the fall, if the leaves are changing colors, just taking a moment just to
Yeah.
look at them. The springtime now, watching everything pop up, and in the
Mm-hmm.
summertime, just feeling the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it really does make all the difference in terms of just having gratitude for the moment and knowing that everything you're going to work through,
Mm-hmm.
where you have gotten through your hardest day if you're still
Yeah.
here today.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
hard thing to realize. I want to end on a quote real quick,
Yeah.
and I just want to get your opinion. It's always love The earth moves and the heaven
Oh.
holds. Why is that so special to you?
Do you know what's on my arm?
Of course I do. I had to do my research. Yeah.
It's tattooed on my arm. So, okay, that was so funny. I thought you were going to say a quote from something else. um, so this is a little fragment of a poem by a poet, a German poet, Holderlin, and I came across it reading an essay by Heidegger called "Poetically Man Dwells." And Heidegger is a very controversial figure in the history of philosophy, which we don't need to talk about. But I was reading this essay that a friend handed to me, actually because I was really struggling. I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school, and
Yeah.
this loss of my parents, on top of a lot of other things, really separated me from what I had thought my set of beliefs were. And I didn't know what to believe anymore. And this friend handed me this essay, which is about Heidegger's writing about what a strange thing it is to be human and to dwell in this place, Earth, where we are looking towards the heavens and aiming towards the heavens. And it's basically just like a meditation on that, how weird that is to be human. And he has this little quote from Holderlin: "Always love, the earth moves and heaven holds." And I remember where I was in that moment when I read that sentence, because I thought to myself, okay, that I can believe. Like, none of this makes any neat sense. Like, a lot of people in the Catholic Church are telling me, like, oh, my dad's in heaven, like eating Doritos and watching me, and this all makes sense in this beautiful way. And I'm like, go fuck yourself. My whole life just fell apart, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know what to believe in. This doesn't jive with my concept of God that I was raised in.
Yeah.
But this idea that earth moves and heaven holds, like, I can get behind that. And so that became actually like a really foundational belief for what then became me kind of rebuilding myself and my life and my future and all that kind of stuff. And so I had it tattooed on my arm in my dad's handwriting, which is a cool thing.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's beautiful.
It's tiny. It's a tiny little joy. And it's on my arm and I get to look at it all the time and be like, oh.
Every time. A massive thank you once again to MC for joining me for today. It is really amazing as I enter into this new phase of the show, getting to meet people who I never thought I would get to meet, just how open and honest they are with me and with all of you, the audience. And today's conversation was just special. And I really hope you had some solid takeaways from today. I certainly did. Once again, I said at the beginning, I can't thank you enough for being a supporter. It really does mean the world to me that I get to put this on for all of you. If you support the show, please follow along and leave a rating. It really does help grow the show. It helps me get incredible guests to join the show, just like MC. And I can't thank you enough. Until next time, see you.